Let's talk about the 200 books I read in 2024. Hello, my name is Emily Crow from The Cozy Crow and welcome to my YouTube channel. And today I am so excited to share with you my final stats from the year 2024 of everything that I read. I've got all the typical stats that I've included in my other reading wrap-up videos, but I've got a lot here that are new as I looked back on this entire year, including my top 24 books of 2024. And surprisingly, I have 25 5-star reads. So I'm gonna share with you everything that I rated a 5-star, yes, including the honorable mention that did not quite make the cut into my top 24 list for the year. But let's talk about all of the other statistics that I have before I get to that list. So you heard me right, I had 200 reads because some of them were like novellas or short stories, things like that. But I had 200 reads in the year 2024. I wasn't trying to hit a specific goal number. In 2023, I read 125 books. I was really close to 200, and so I really pushed in the end of December to finish that many books so I could get to a nice number of 200. I kind of wish I didn't try quite that hard, but I'm too much of a completionist at heart to not try and go for a really good number when I'm trying to finish my reading for the year. So it is what it is. I have my flaws. Let's look at the genres that I read. Now, a lot of the books I read fall into multiple genres, and so I tried to pick the best genre to just pick one genre per book. So, you know, romantasy is not on this list, but some of them I thought were more romance than fantasy. Some of them I thought were more fantasy than romance, things like that. So let's take a look at what I read. I read 75 fantasy novels, which checks out. I read a lot of fantasy. I also read 50 romance books. That is also a lot. I read 16 mysteries. I read 12 sci-fis. Lots of sci-fi novellas, actually, which I really like. I read 11 horrors. I read 10 nonfictions, which is definitely more than I thought I would looking back at the year. That's still only 2% of my reads. So it doesn't sound like a lot, but 10 is more than I anticipated for sure. I read 8 thrillers, also more than I thought I had read. I read just 8 general fiction type of stories. I read 6 magical realism, so like slight magical elements thrown in or, you know, needing to suspend my disbelief a little bit on how things turned out. 6 magical realism or speculative fiction type of stories. I read 3 historical fictions. And I read 1 humor, a little book meant to be silly and funny. So that's a breakdown of all 200 books that I read. Again, a lot of books fit in multiple genres, or like I had a historical fantasy, I had a historical fiction that had like a fantasy element and a romance element. So just trying to pick the best choice in this list. When we look at all the books I read, I had 4 rereads. I don't do a lot of rereads because there's just so much I want to read, but my 4 rereads were Emma by Jane Austen, The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes, in preparation for the movie that came out, maybe it came out at the end of last year or at the very beginning of this year. So I read through the whole Hunger Games series. I watched all the movies, but I was a little late at finishing everything before I saw this movie, but I did finish this book in January this year by Suzanne Collins. I also reread Legends and Lattes by Travis Baldree. This is like a special exclusive edition with some cool sprayed edges, some beautiful end papers. Beautiful. I really liked that I read it again because I appreciated it more the second time around, but the prequel is still my favorite. And then I also reread The Empress of Salt and Fortune by Niveau. I read 8 classics, so not a ton. A lot of shorter stories that I would consider classics fall in that category. But we'll talk about my goals for 2025 in a little bit. When looking at BIPOC authors, I read 32 books published by BIPOC authors. And now this was kind of hard to find. I had to do a lot of research on my own, so that number might not be exactly right. But to the best of my knowledge, I read 32 books from different BIPOC authors. Let me share with you some of the standouts I had in BIPOC authors that I really hope to read from again in the future. Gerardo Salmano Cordova, who wrote Monstrillo. Denise Williams, who wrote Love and Other Flight Delays. R.F. Kuang, who wrote Yellowface. Chloe Gong, who I love, who wrote Immortal Longings that I read this year. Abby Jimenez, who wrote a few things I read this year. She's actually Fil-Am, she's Filipino American. So that was interesting to find out in my looking around. Saba Tahir, who wrote the Ember in the Ashes series. Sangu Mandanna, who wrote The Very Secret Society of Irregular Witches. So yeah, I am surprised by how many BIPOC authors were represented in my reads because that wasn't an intentional goal of mine. but I definitely want to read more. Again, we'll talk about 2025 goals in just a minute. I did not finish 3 books intentionally. Like, I had 3 DNFs in the year, though I have a couple things that I'm still waffling about, but the 3 DNFs I had this year were Not Just Jane by Shelley DeWeese. This was a nonfiction about less well-known Victorian female authors. It just ended up being really boring for me and kind of repetitive. Seeking Persephone by Sarah Eden. I have read some of her things, especially when I was younger, and so I wanted to read others in a series that I had loved a book in previously, but I just really did not enjoy reading the very beginning of this. And I was like, this is gonna be not my favorite, so I might as well just not read this book. It was definitely aged younger than I was looking for when I was picking this book up. And then The Deal by Elle Kennedy. I don't think I'm gonna like Elle Kennedy's things. I just did not like these characters. I did not like the writing style. I did not like the vulgarity. I did not like the attitudes these characters had. I just wasn't having a great time. So I yeeted myself from that after just a couple chapters. Out of the 200 books I read, 130 of them were part of series, which is wild. Let me share some standout series with you that I really enjoyed. The King of Scars duology by Leigh Bardugo. Might as well throw in the other Grishaverse extra books, so The Lives of Saints and The Language of Thorns. That has different like short stories and little folk tales about the world of the Grishaverse. The Sworn Soldiers series, which is a horror series by T. Kingfisher. It's a historical horror. The Alex Stern series. This is Hellbent, the second book in that series by Leigh Bardugo as well. The Throne of Glass series. Again, some of these are missing because they're in my top 24 of 2024. I finished Maisie Dobbs. The very last book came out. This is The Comfort of Ghosts by Jacqueline Winspear. This is book 18 in the series, and I finished the series, which is kind of bittersweet, honestly. The Shepherd King series by Rachel Gillig, favorite from December. The Chaotic Orbits series from Beth Revis. This is the second book in the series. The third one is coming out in just a few months, I think. They're like comedic sci-fi novellas. I love them. I read the Caraval series, including this novella, this holiday novella that just came out. And I read the Once Upon a Broken Heart series. These covers are the UK covers. So cute. I also read the Covenant series by Jennifer L. Armentrout, my first of hers that I've read, and I really want to read more from her. Look at those pretty colors for the sprayed edges. And of course, I discovered Abby Jimenez this year, and I've loved her Part of Your World series that this is a part of. So yeah, and looking at that, I finished 25 series, or at least caught up all the way in 25 series. And then I technically started 47 series this year, but there's a lot of those I don't intend to continue. I didn't do that statistic though, because I didn't feel like it. That is a lot of series that I started and explored. So we'll see, I guess, what next year holds for the series that I finish or continue on in. The longest book that I read this year was Kingdom of Ash by Sarah J. Maas. It is like 980 pages, 984 pages. Ridiculous. And then the shortest book I read was actually a short story by Edgar Allan Poe, The Fall of the House of Usher, which is 36 pages. The oldest book that I read was Emma by Jane Austen that was published in 1816. And the newest book that I read that was published most recently was published on December 4th, I think, and it was How to Steal a Galaxy by Beth Revis. And I hadn't realized it was so new, so that's really exciting that I got to read it pretty fast after its release date. So let's talk about my goals for the year 2025. I want to be a lot more intentional about the reads that I have, especially BIPOC reads. I would love to purposefully choose to read at least one book by a BIPOC author every month. And now that number means a minimum of 12. That's lower than the 38 that I read in 2024, but my goal is to be intentional about it, to actively choose to read a new to me BIPOC author and to really expand the reading that I do so that I can highlight those authors and diversify my reading. So that's a goal of mine, to intentionally choose one book a month that is by a BIPOC author and making sure that I expand my reading. I also want to intentionally read at least one classic a month because there's a lot of really good books that I've never read, or really significant books in American literature or even just world literature that I have not had a chance to read. So I really want to read more classics and to just like build a base of classic literature and classic reading and mix that into like the fun, silly, goofy reads that I like to read as well. I also have a goal to read 25 books off of my physical TBR in the year 2025, and I have a video that may or may not come out before or after this. I've filmed it already. I don't know when it'll be published, but I have a video where I will be talking about those 25 books that I want to read from my physical TBR shelf. And so that is a goal of mine. I fell a little bit short for 2024. I finished 22 of the 24 books, which is actually really good. There's one book I may or may not DNF. I can't quite decide. And there's one book that I just forgot that I had a library loan until it lapsed, and then I couldn't get to it before the end of the year. So that was my own fault. So hopefully I will read that book coming up soon. I also would love to have a net negative in my total books in my TBR closet. I store my books in my closet, like, yes, where my clothes are and shoes and things like that. I also have books. I would love to decrease the amount of space those take up, and I would love to read more than I am purchasing. So that's my overall goal. Last year I did track my net books in and out, and I had a net like 37, but considering I read 200 books, I don't think that's too bad. But I would love to have a net negative for the year 2025 and just read more from my shelves and try to tackle those books so that I can like get to the things that really spark my interest when they come out, instead of adding them to the backlog of all the things I hope to get to eventually. So those are my tentative goals. Again, no specific reading for the entire year, because I just want to enjoy what I read and gain a lot from what I read, and even explore a little bit in my reading and kind of see where the year takes me. Now we're gonna do a rapid fire round of the top 24 books that I read in 2024. Starting with our honorable mention, Circe by Madeline Miller. This was really well written. It's a historical fiction, fantasy, like Greek myth retelling type of a story. I love her language style. There were some deeper and more emotional themes in here. This is my lowest pick because there was nothing wrong with this book. Everything was so good, but it didn't connect with me as much as the rest of these books. But again, that was my only 5-star that did not make it onto my top 24 list. So let's start. Number 24 is Mixed Signals by B.K. Borison. I've loved reading the Love Light Farms series, and this is book 3. This was just a really sweet story between Layla, the bake shop owner, and Caleb, who is someone in the community that we've seen before. It was just a very sweet and tender romance that they got to know each other. There was a little bit of fake dating, and it just felt like this whole town was rooting them on, and it just gave me like sweet, wholesome vibes. Number 23 is Thornhedge by T. Kingfisher. This was a dark fairy tale. I think it's a retelling of something. It's a retelling of Sleeping Beauty. That's what it is. There's this fairy that's a toad that a prince runs into, and the toad is trying to protect the world from the sleeping princess that's locked in her castle. So this is a really fun little retelling where things were kind of tipped on their heads. I think that everything T. Kingfisher writes is really great, and this is a really good, inclusive little story that is good for just like a single sitting to read if you're interested in that kind of dark fantasy, dark fairy tale retelling. Book 22, this is The Very Secret Society of Irregular Witches by Sangu Mandanna. This was like kind of a witch coming of age with a romance type of a tale. So the main character, Mika, is a witch, and she is also doing fake witch things on her TikTok just for funsies. And people who know about actual witches notice and realize she's a real witch who's trying to masquerade as a pretend witch. And so they enlist her help to train these 3 young girls to grow up and learn how to be witches because they don't have a good mentor for them. And so it's really fun seeing her interactions with these kids and also seeing her relationship change with one of the other adults that's at this house that these girls are staying at, and just the hope and excitement for this found family and what they hope to gain from it, the things that these girls learn, all the ups and downs of being a girl and learning how to be a better witch and how she is navigating. I really liked how this main character had some depth but also had a lot of internal like stability and coping and coming to terms with the struggles they had faced, and they had grown a lot in their life. And so you saw like the aftermath of when they were in their like safe and stable place after the trauma that they had experienced. So that was like really wholesome and touching to see. Book 21. Okay, so this is Abby Jimenez's Part of Your World. This is the first in this interconnected standalone series. It's a story about a doctor who has always been the disappointment of her family. Her husband really doesn't treat her well, so they're getting a divorce. She's going through a lot of upheaval. She feels like she doesn't even want to do what her career is right now. She wants to take a different path, but she's already faced a lot of backlash from her family and doesn't want any more. So she's trying to find herself, and she ends up falling for a guy in a small town that she was just passing through, and she's trying to reconcile these two different lives that she's kind of living simultaneously, and she's trying to figure out her equilibrium. This next book is The Measure by Nikki Erlick. This is a debut from her, I think. And this is a speculative fiction where everyone wakes up one day and finds a box with their name on it outside of their door, and inside is a string that they've come to find out is the measure of their life, like the length of their life. People are reacting to the presence of those strings. They're reacting to the length of their own strings, the length of other people's strings. There's some discrimination that turns up. People who have the same length of string are choosing different paths based on their interpretation of that. So it was a touching and meaningful book that made me feel a lot of things. It definitely had some connections to like the COVID pandemic era, so not quite a trigger warning, but it definitely tapped into those emotions I was feeling in 2020. And so I think that made this even more of an emotional story that had a personal connection to me, and seeing how the world collectively and individually made decisions based on this pandemic that was happening. Honestly, like a really amazing story that really touched me. And it gave me a lot of hope when in that kind of story, you might lose a lot of hope. The next is Exit Strategy by Martha Wells. I just love all the Murderbot books. I think this might have been the fourth novella in the series. I honestly don't remember a ton about what this one's about, but I do remember that I love how Murderbot is learning to care and feeling things. They're not sure how they feel about the fact that they're feeling things. And so I think that's really tender and touching to see the humanity in Murderbot in this book. The next three I'm going to talk about are part of the same series. Throne of Glass. Yes, not all of them are my favorite, and that's okay. Three of them I rated 5 stars this year. First one on this list is Heir of Fire by Sarah J. Maas. This is the third book in the series. And this is where Selena travels to a different country to learn, to grow, to shape her power. You just see so much character growth, and the whole trajectory of the series changes at this point. So it was so fun to read along and find out where the series was going and to see these changes and growth. It was just really fun to be reading this book. And then Queen of Shadows by Sarah J. Maas. I think this might be the fourth book. Yes, the fourth book. Oh my goodness, so much happened in the story, and by the end of it, there's like so much drama as Aelin is coming to terms with her heritage and things. I loved it. And then finally, surprise! Tower of Dawn by Sarah J. Maas. Not everyone loves this book. This is about Chaol, and I didn't like Chaol that much. He was really bothering me. But this book redeemed him for me. I feel like this was really well written for me to understand him. And I really loved the slow pacing of this book, honestly. Like, I feel like it fit the story, and we still got lots of information. I don't know, I feel like this was very well written and really added a lot to the series. And so I really loved reading this book. Next we have Ruthless Vows by Rebecca Ross. This is the Barnes & Noble exclusive edition because the cover is different. You may not be a goddess, but nor am I God. Despite our mundane lives, perhaps we make our own magic with words. So sweet. Like, oh my goodness. I adored Divine Rivals, and I really loved Ruthless Vows as well. You see the conclusion of this duology. It is YA historical fantasy with a strong romance element, as you see Roman regain his memory and learn a lot about these gods that are warring. You see Iris try to figure out how to help Roman and try to figure out how she can help fight the good fight against Deka, who is an evil god. And so it's just really fun to see like the culmination of this, and this is a very different vibe than Divine Rivals. I would say I think I like Divine Rivals a little bit more, but I still rated this a 5-star, and I love this story. I love these different like historical fantasy elements. I love the romance in this. I love seeing these characters come back together and the tension that was there, and I was so invested in this story. And next I've got Ninth House by Leigh Bardugo. This is my Barnes & Noble exclusive edition just because it was some fun colors, and there's like an extra chapter at the end or two where Leigh Bardugo has some annotations, which is really cool. I like how her voice is very different in adult books versus her young adult books. It's very dark and gothic, like dark academia vibes. It's a low fantasy as Alex Stern is applying her special paranormal skills to help the secret societies at Yale campus stay in line so they don't do anything too bad. It was a very different book of hers, and I really loved this different direction that it went in and what I learned from this book. Really fascinating, really different, and I really loved it. Next is Mistborn by Brandon Sanderson. My first Brandon Sanderson was Tress of the Emerald Sea. I love that, and I made a goal that I wanted to read through all of his Cosmere books. So starting with Mistborn, I love this story. It seems kind of long, but there's a lot that happens in this book. I feel like the pacing is really good. I really like how there's a good balance between action and political intrigue and rebellion and high stakes versus lower stakes. There's like a romance element. There's just like a little bit of everything in here, and I like how the balance is in this book a lot. And I like this fantasy world and the story. I feel like the magical element is so unique and so well thought out. It's just so intricate but very approachable and easy to understand. So I feel like there's something really special about the Mistborn books. This next book is The Adventures of Amina Al-Sirafe by Shannon Chakraborty. This is like a historical fantasy set in like Indian Ocean, Arabic countries type of, I think it's like 1500s time period if I remember correctly. I haven't freshened up on this book, but it's hilarious. The voice of the main character as she's telling her story, she's like a 40-something-year-old woman that used to be a pirate, and she picks up one last job to really like set her family up for life, even though she's been retired for like 15 years or something. It's just so funny because she's very relatable as like a 40-something-year-old woman who's like, you know, sleeps wrong and then her back hurts the rest of the day, like kind of thing. The way that this book is written is so funny, hearing her narrative voice come through as she's like telling the story to a scribe. And she's like, no, wait, don't write that. No, that's not what I meant. Like, it's super funny, really fun fantasy to read about that also has a historical element that I wasn't super familiar with, and so it didn't feel overdone. It just felt fresh and new. This is Close Knit by Jenny Colgan, and I've read a lot of her books before, but this one really took the cake for me. It is about Gertie, who lives in this really small Scottish island town. She has a very kind of a small life. Like, she works at a supermarket. She lives with her aunts. She goes to knitting club every week. She gets this new opportunity to work for a local airline that flies between the islands in this like northern Scottish area. And so she's kind of expanding her life and exploring new things and meeting new people. And you're seeing the changes that she goes through as she kind of comes to terms with what really matters to her and what she wants to be doing with her life now that she's kind of at a crossroads. And so it was just really wholesome, really funny. Like, I really like Jenny Colgan's voice. The humor in it is something that I really enjoy. There's a subtle romance plot in here, like very subtle. You see some really dramatic and also small happenings within this little tight-knit community, this close-knit community. And there's also a really strong element of knitting because that's something that Gertie loves to do. And you can tell that the author actually knits and like knows what they're talking about in the way that they write about this character, and that knitting isn't just a device used by the author, but it is part of the characterization of this character. And so I really appreciated the way that this book was written, and it was just so wholesome. Really just made me excited to pick it up and read it. I have a lot of notes in here, things that I wanted to point out that I was hoping to share on my book club, and I never got to because no one else could read the book when I was reading it. This next book is Tom Lake by Ann Patchett. And this is a story where a mom is sharing with her daughters the experience she had growing up when she was in her teens and her 20s, and she played Emily in Our Town, and that was kind of like her role. And so she kept getting cast in plays as Emily in Our Town and other similar roles. Like, her acting career was pretty short-lived, but she had a very distinctive flavor. And so she's telling her daughters what she did as a young adult with her short acting career, the decisions she made, the people she met, including a famous star, and the little fling that she had that summer that they acted together in Michigan. And this was so cozy. I felt like I was one of her daughters. It's narrated by Meryl Streep. Very highly recommend. It was such a good audiobook. I felt like I was one of the daughters listening in, picking cherries on my family's orchard, listening to my mom tell the story about her past and learning about the choices that my mom had made to get to where she was that day and how she didn't regret any of those decisions, the person that she became because of them, even the decisions that in hindsight might seem like not the best choice, because we're all human, right? It was so warm and like familial, and I just wanted to dwell in this world, in this family forever. It was just so nice to just listen to the story and really immerse myself in it. Highly recommend this book. Next one, Full Speed to a Crash Landing by Beth Revis. And this is one that I kind of stumbled upon, and I am so happy I did. This is a comedic cozy sci-fi where the main character Ada is employed by someone to be a scavenger in this sci-fi world. She's a human. It's been a while since humans have had a great time on planet Earth. Planet Earth is not in good shape, by the way, ecologically. And Ada is trying to scavenge. She gets picked up by a larger ship. I love Ada's plucky, realist, but also like hilarious character. Like, she's so funny, and you can tell there's some secrets going on, some things that aren't being revealed, but you also see some truth and some sincerity from Ada too. So it's a really interesting combination. By the end of this book, you see a lot of those truths come out and your mind is blown. Very Ocean's 11 spy type of vibes. This is the first novella in a trilogy, and I loved having this book just kind of pop into the rotation. I was not anticipating how good it was going to be. This is a nonfiction, which I don't read a lot of nonfiction, and I don't rate a lot of nonfiction 5 stars, but I loved this book. This is The Last Days of the Dinosaurs by Riley Black. What does Steve Brusati say? This is pop science that reads like a fantasy novel, but backed up by hard facts. I was so impressed by how easy to read this book was. Pop science for sure, very approachable science for the layperson, that was written like a movie. Like, I could really see what these dinosaurs were experiencing, and even afterwards. So you start out like immediately before the meteor, and then moments after the crash, hours after the crash, days after the crash, weeks after the crash, months, years, 100 years, 1,000 years, 1,000,000 years after the crash, and seeing the impact of such a moment that could have gone so many different ways and had so many variables, like the almost utter destruction of the world because of that meteor crash and subsequent reactions to that, and how that really shaped the way the world is today. Like, there was such a small margin for the world to have that kind of a disaster that went as bad as it did, but not too bad, if that makes sense. It really opened my mind to a lot of aspects of extinction that I hadn't thought of before. It was so approachable. I felt things for these dinosaurs and these creatures, and honestly, the suffering that they went through, it just didn't become real to me until I read this book. And so it was so meaningful. It also, on a personal level, it made me feel more connected to God. And I know that wasn't necessarily what Riley Black was going for, but I feel like that shows a really good book where I have takeaways that the author didn't necessarily intend, but I learned things from it personally. Like, it wasn't just a science book, it also was a meaningful book for me, if that makes sense. Next book is a romance, Out on a Limb by Hannah Bonham Young. I loved how this is like the only one-night stand book where I am 100% convinced of their chemistry and that they belong together, and I'm like totally on board with like, yes, you guys need a connection, and then things happen, she's pregnant, and they are trying to navigate co-parenting and also building their acquaintance into friendship and then into something more. So sweet and wholesome, so meaningful. I really love these two characters. They had flaws, but they were realistic and reasonable flaws, where I still adored both of these human beings and the relationship they were building and the choices that they were making in reaction to this event that happened to them. Two Twisted Crowns by Rachel Gillig. It's rare that a sequel is rated higher than a first novel, and this one totally lived up to the hype. I really love the series, honestly, but this book took a totally different direction than I anticipated, which was really refreshing, because at the end of the first book, I really didn't know where the story was going because it's a duology. It felt like we might get cut off from a big portion of the story, but I really loved how we still got Raven and Elspeth's perspectives. We still got the Nightmare's perspectives. We learned a lot about all these characters as they responded to the tragedies that happened at the end of the first book, but you also get a lot more about Elm and Ione and their relationship with one another. I love this world, the vibes of this world building. I love the magic system and the repercussions of this magic system, both on individuals using the magic and on the society as a whole. I just love this book. Such a good fantasy, and I love fantasy duologies too. Okay, we're in our top 5. This is Bookshops and Bone Dust by Travis Baldree. Like I mentioned, this is the prequel to Legends and Lattes, and again, I got the really pretty edition that makes me so happy. And this takes Viv's story when she is a pretty new adventurer, but she gets hurt and she has to stay behind in this dingy little sea town while the rest of her party goes and tries to defeat this bad guy. So she's feeling down in the dumps, and she starts to explore the sea town. She starts to make friends. She starts to help out at a bookshop. You end up seeing more of the fantasy element in this book, seeing this like overarching plot of, you know, this villain, and there's some stuff going on that Viv is learning about. And so she's still being helpful to this adventure that her campaign is going on, even though she's staying behind. So I really liked the balance of this book in being like the cozy fantasy vibes, but also having that adventuring campaigning side that you don't see as much in Legends and Lattes. And so I really loved having the mix in this book. These 3 I placed together because they're part of a series, and now I feel bad that one of the books in this quartet was not in my top 24. This is the An Ember in the Ashes series. So this is by Sabaa Tahir, An Ember in the Ashes, Torch Against the Night, and A Reaper at the Gates. Now, the 4th book did not quite make the cut for me. It was missing a little bit in the climax, I feel like. But this series is amazing, so that's why this is like my number 2, 3, 4 slots. Even from the first book, I was so emotionally invested in all of these characters and how their stories would come together. I didn't know where the story was going, but in a way that kept me on the edge of my seat the whole time. I loved the growth and changes that happened within these characters as they learned things and experienced things and became different people. I had an appreciation for every single one of these characters, and Helene was always my favorite, but I loved Helene the whole time. And there was just so much strife and emotion tied in with these characters, their responses to what was going on. There's a lot of political intrigue, there's a lot of death and destruction and war going on. So there's a lot of things that like made me really emotionally invested and feeling really connected with these characters and the growth of the journey that they went on. Definitely made me cry a lot, like this whole series, but it was so emotional and meaningful. I would highly recommend it. It's a YA series, but it read like an adult fantasy series. It didn't feel like the relationships were too young. It felt very mature and adult, but the characters are in the like YA new adult range, and so that's why this is a YA book, but reads very different than any other YA series I've ever read. So this is something really special, honestly. And I have the old covers. I was able to buy them right before they changed to the new covers. And our last book, the one that I ranked as my top read of 2024, is Just for the Summer by Abby Jimenez. And the reason that I thought this was my favorite book of the year was because I finished this book in like 3 or 4 days as an ebook, which is very, very fast for me. I can read an audiobook that fast, but ebook, that was amazing. Normally, I read 1 to 2 chapters in my ebook at night, just until I fall asleep, kind of winding down for the night. This book, I could not put down. I was so engaged in it that it wouldn't make me sleepy. I would read for like an hour or 2 every single night. Like, I could not put this book down. I was so invested. I really understood this main character, Emma, and her experience, and I think partly that's from her being a nurse, and I just feel like this character was so well written that I connected with her, even though a lot of her lived experiences were different than mine. I just loved seeing her growth throughout this book, and that, you know, the ending didn't turn out perfectly, but it was perfectly written for these characters. I wouldn't have wanted their story told any other way. I feel like it really suited what these characters needed, and the growth that these characters experienced, and it was just something really, really special. There you have it. I read 200 books in 2024, and we've talked about my 24 favorites. We've talked about some 2024 stats. We've even talked about my goals for 2025. Let me know if you have any reading goals for this coming year. I would love to hear what you're hoping to get to in 2025. And until next time, happy reading. Bye!